Well, what if we move forward a bit to the Reformation?
Yeah.
Just as an example to look at, the interpretations of this metaphor. It's one
Yeah.
among many, many examples.
I think we'll go very quickly here because we spent so much time with problems that we need to get to constructing the alternative. Um, all of Calvin's commentaries from the 16th century had a image in the front page, what's called a printer's mark. And he had various printers, but they were mostly from the same family. And the Estienne family, there was father, son, and then other sons, so grandfather, we'd have to say. And um, they originally, the grandfather, if you will, was in Paris, and he was a Catholic. But then he or one of the sons, I can't remember all the stories, um, went to Geneva and became a Protestant and was and did Calvin. Calvin, of course, was in Paris and went to Geneva. And his mark was this olive tree with himself, in theory, the printer, kneeling down and making the statement that we can see in the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. So it blows this image up a little bit and says in the Latin that they are broken off, I shall be inserted. And Calvin did not, I don't know what input he had or did not have, but his theology influenced these printers. And it was actually sort of pretty political, which printer you used and didn't use, and which one was in trouble or not in trouble for what they printed at the time. And by the way, the printers, they owned the book. They made their living from selling books. So it was kind of interesting. In this front plate, what do we see? We see an image of an olive tree in which branches are on the ground or falling to the ground. So they've clearly been broken off, cut off.
Cut off with a sickle-shaped knife.
Sickle, if you look at the top of the cloud figure, is God with a sickle in one hand and a branch that's just been removed in the other hand. And if you go back down to the tree, you'll notice that there are these ball-looking figures, which are the image is trying to evoke the places where grafts have taken place. And so if you look carefully at this, you'll see all the major boughs in the tree have been cut so that there are almost no original branches. I think I can count 2 original branches one can find.
And it looks like the cutting isn't finished. I wouldn't expect them to survive, actually.
Exactly. So yeah, there's 2 living branches left, and the sickle is still at work. I don't know how literal they're trying to be there, but all the rest of the branches are that one wild shoot that we read about in the olive tree allegory. And they're already bearing fruit and indistinguishable from the older branches, the cultivated branches. And do we see any sense of what I'm pretty sure almost anybody could read Romans 11, even in the English translation, and at least sense that Paul is trying to evoke empathy, and at least sympathy, at least grace towards. And instead, what we have is unabashed replacement theological thinking that I replaced them. Thank you so much. And with no real concern for the ones going off, which I just want to point out, and I don't probably have to point this out for those who know anything about Calvinism, but just some may not. This is highly ironic because Calvinist theology celebrates the certainty of salvation, that God would never renege on his promises. Well, this is a celebration of discontinuity with the promises made to Israel, original Israelites, and instead replaced with somebody else on the basis that they did not perform or did not believe a certain thing. which ought to be a problem for Calvin to have as his front plate, one would think. But apparently it wasn't. It was used in all of his different commentaries and books and so on,
I
and by
mean,
many others of the time.
yeah, I think if we extend this beyond Calvin and Calvin's works and this particular printer, we could say that this image represents essentially the standard Christian interpretation of the metaphor for
Right,
many, many centuries in all
right.
sorts of different streams of tradition.
And we've shown that in the NRSV, translators in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century are a part of this paradigm. It's a circle in which this is what people presume Paul is trying to communicate.
Well,
Oh, see the
on that
problem.
note, yeah, let's go to see what he might actually be communicating as a Jew of the first century, which, if we understand him in his own context, might be rather different.
Yeah. So the prior language to the allegory, which we already mentioned briefly in Romans 11:11, he starts out, have they not stumbled so as to fall? And the answer is no, no way, not at all. Miganita. Rather, deliverance for the nations, and this is me helping the translation, trying to fill it in. Everyone has to fill it in. So let's fill it in a way that fits what he's trying to say. Have they fallen? No way. So deliverance for the nations arrives by their misstep, by their tripping, which is in order to vex them, to emulate me. In other words, I'm squeezing this together with something he says in the next part of the passage. Not to make them jealous, as people normally read this as a negative thing, not to make Israel jealous, which would make little sense. If you don't believe this proposition and some other people do, you wouldn't see yourself as being jealous of them. You wouldn't care, or you would be resentful, or not resentful, you would be dismissive of them. But jealousy means in Greek, the word Paul uses, it primarily means to emulate, to want for yourself. And Paul is talking about, actually, in that part of the passage, that he celebrates his own ministry to these non-Jews. He addresses them as the non-Jews I'm addressing here. That my ministry, that is to say, me doing Israel's role as a herald of the nations, as Israel, as a part of Israel, as a representative of Israel. If you respond positively to this is his message, that will give them pause to want to emulate me, because they may stop and say, whoa, wait a minute. People from the nations are turning from their God to worship the one God, and they're respecting Israelite tradition, and they're becoming Jewishish. Maybe we should stop and reconsider what this guy is claiming. So he wants them, his fellow Jews, to emulate them. And these non-Jews, he's basically explaining, you're part of my strategy. And if you act arrogant, and if you are dismissive, and if you think you've replaced the Jews, and if you live unconcerned with their sensibilities, then they will reject this. And we won't arrive at the fullness that we're after. So again, he's explaining a process, and he's kind of explaining what I see him saying is, you, as we talked about earlier in another case, in the assembly, it's supposed to represent the end of age way of living, where there are differences, but not the normal discrimination. And that should give other people pause to consider the claims we're making about what time it is because of Jesus as Messiah.
It also occurs to me that the root here, that's often translated, well, the word is translated often to provoke to jealousy, but the
Right,
root is equally often, or maybe more often, translated with words related to zeal, to being
right.
zealous rather than jealous.
Yeah,
And so there's not a distinction in the Greek, or for that matter in the Hebrew, where there's the same problem
right.
in various passages of translation. But so if you combine jealousy with zeal, or find some meaning that incorporates both of those, I think that goes back to your stimulate idea, or prick as well.
Right,
Like, they're looking at these other people from the nations and what they're doing, and they might get excited. They might get stimulated by that. Wow, this is
right,
interesting. What's going on? Like you said,
right,
we have to rethink what's
right.
happening.
Right.
I mean, and again, it bears repeating. It seems obvious probably to you because you've been studying this for so long, but many people might have difficulty imagining themselves in that situation in which an Israelite or a Judean or Jew, however you want to put it, like Paul, would be part of a relatively small people that's seeking to worship a single God, which they believe is the God who created the entire universe and
Right.
therefore the king over the whole world. But almost everyone else is not doing that and has lots of other gods and worships Caesar and worships their local deities and has various gods and goddesses. And those people all think that the Jews are strange. Not all of them, but many of them think the Jews are strange and, are poor because they have so few gods. And then what he's describing is, look, all these people who look down on us and think we're the weird ones because we worship one God and we don't fit into the general Greco-Roman culture of the civilized world as we know it. Look how many of them are now coming to us and saying, actually, the Jewish way is the right way. They're
Right.
joining to us. Something interesting is taking place here.
What Bible do you read? And how do you know it's the right one?
There's only one version of the Bible, right?
It might surprise you to learn that Bible translations led to many versions of Holy Scripture. Long ago, translators interpreted the Hebrew Bible, ensuring it would be enjoyed in many languages. But when they encountered Hebrew words they didn't understand, translators relied on their individual cultural context and used different words with different meanings unrelated to the original ones. This led to Bible versions that lacked the full, beautiful, original explanations becoming part of our history. That's why when you join our online classes, you'll get back to the source of the original Hebrew Bible to uncover hidden meanings.
Get back to the source. Join our online course today, where the treasures of the authentic Bible await you.
Click on the link and register to start your biblical experience.